Thom Hartmann is America's #1 progressive talk radio host. You can find him daily from noon to 3 Eastern, 9 to noon Pacific, pretty much anywhere you can find radio or progressive radio at that. And he's the New York Times bestselling author of dozens of books, one of which is The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living, another of which is The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, which I'm very proud to have worked on the updated edition of. Before we get too much further, Thom, welcome back to the Blue Ridge Breakdown. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Troy. It's always nice to hang out with you. My cat says hi too.
I, well, the cat's the real star here. This is the internet after all.
He's an old cat. He lives in my office now because the other cats pick on him. So,
oh, well, I finally got a second door on my office studio so that I can keep the cats out. There's one that would never get on camera, but would always just cause a nuisance. But as we're recording this on January 14th, 2026, I see basically every scale I look at, from the sort of intra-party Democratic level out to the streets of Minneapolis, out to the streets of Venezuela, the sort of existential question of, are we the people going to be in charge of our future here? Are we going to be able to do something about the existential crises of machine learning, artificial intelligence, automation, all of this, the existential crisis of climate change? Elon Musk has said that, don't bother squirreling away money anymore for retirement because in 10 or 20 years, it'll be, irrelevant, says a guy who's about to be a trillionaire. And in the streets of Minneapolis, I think we're seeing the same sort of thing play out, whether we're going to have a bunch of masked bandits who are accountable only to Kristi Noem and Donald Trump, basically, roaming the streets and deciding who is ripe for violence, or are we going to take control of our country? And the parallels between I see like the end of the Roman Republic into the Empire stages. I see the British, the Boston Massacre kind of has been coming to mind as I look at Minneapolis. I see FDR talked about in one of his inaugural addresses. We fought the enemy with the American Revolution. We fought the enemy within with the Civil War. And at the time FDR was saying that, we were again confronting the enemy without with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan. So with all of that, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you today and in the midst of all of this is that you have literally written a book on American democracy and rediscovering humanity's ancient way of living. So with all of that as primer, what do you mean when you're talking about reclaiming humanity's ancient way of living, for one? And for two, what do we have with American democracy? How is this so special? Why is this so special?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we have right now is increasingly oligarchy in the United States, unfortunately. But democracy is the oldest operating system for humanity. Virtually every Aboriginal or Indigenous tribe around the world is organized democratically or something close to it. It is the system that the founders of this country, Madison and Jefferson and Franklin in particular, they were the three who had a lot of interactions with Native Americans as they were growing up and throughout their lives, particularly Jefferson and Franklin. And what they observed was democracy actually happening in these communities. The largest of which, of course, was the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. And so, this message that there is a way that humans can live where power flows from the bottom up, not the top down, where government derives its credibility, its authority from the consent of the governed, to quote the Declaration of Independence. And it's a principle that really, really resonates with people and has all around the world, over and over and over again, at least in the modern era, in the last 200 years,
right,
changed governments and changed the way that people live. There's always been a dynamic tension. I mean, you could argue that the rise of, in fact, Daniel Quinn makes this argument very cogently in his book Ishmael, which is a novel, but it's just brilliant. I used to know Dan before he passed away. That we were always largely democratic prior to the agricultural revolution, and that what happened with the agricultural revolution was suddenly we went from basically everybody being involved in food production, mostly the men hunting, mostly the women gathering, but nonetheless, everybody was involved in food production. We shifted from that to a very small number of people being in charge of food production, those being the farmers. And the farmers quickly discovered that they could lock up the food. And because, without food, after a couple of weeks, you die, or a couple of months, depending on what your stores are like, in your body. This
Right.
became the power of life or death. And thus came the original kings and kingdoms, that it was all based on locking up the food, on controlling the critical resources, food, water, transportation, stuff like that. So I think in that context, you could make the argument that the post-agricultural revolution era, from 7,000 years ago up until 200 years ago, was an argument for oligarchy and kingdom and authoritarian governance,
Right.
because everybody said all these advances that we made from the Stone Age, literally, to the modern technological age, happened during times of kings and kingdoms and emperors and princes and all that kind of stuff. Um, I've heard that argument made over and over again throughout the years, and the corollary argument, which was being made in a big way during FDR's time, was that if you try to insert too much democracy, you're going to end up with chaos. I mean, this was Russell Kirk's
Right.
paintings in the conservative mind. And I think that what we've found, what we've learned is that even, or particularly maybe with the experiment of democracy in the United States and in Northern Europe, is that high levels of democracy, high levels of diffusion of power, high levels of participatory democracy where power drives from the bottom up, actually enhance the growth of economies and enhance the development of innovation and things like that. So, but there's always been this dynamic tension between democracy and autocracy. And the autocrats, people, you've got right-wing billionaires. One famously said he's increasingly convinced that democracy and freedom are incompatible. That was, I believe, Peter Thiel. You've
Right.
got others who are, saying that women shouldn't have, well, again, it was Peter Thiel. The biggest mistake we made was letting women vote. These are very powerful and influential people who I mean, J.D. Vance wouldn't be vice president without Peter Thiel.
Right.
And so there's this broad skepticism about democracy among the tech bros and the dark enlightenment figures. And I see that as probably the biggest challenge that we have going forward outside of, the Trump administration's naked attempts to turn us into a dictatorship.
Right. I mean, which I honestly see these guys in the wings basically just allowing Trump to have a nice big playpen of whatever, and knowing that he'll be gone soon enough, and then they'll be able to implement whatever they want.
Yeah.
And yeah, and Peter Thiel has also said basically that he doesn't know why should he have to go and appeal to people who are never going to agree with him? Let's use technology to basically go around the institutions of politics and the democratic system and the legislation and all of that. Um, and I've been saying since basically Project 2025 was leaked, as I recall, is how we all found out about it, that look, this is nothing more than a blueprint for what the Powell memo laid out in 1973 that can be implemented as swiftly as humanly possible so that there's no potential for pushback, or it can be done swiftly enough and behind Donald Trump's all of this chaos. But I also now see that, like, I think they and the tech billionaires, I think, are definitely who we're talking about in large part. But uh, what's his name, Singer on Wall Street, it's the classic. It's the sort of the classic villains, ironically enough. But I think now they're basically trying to not only undo the New Deal and the Great Society, which was the goals of Project 2025, but to take us all the way back to pre-Civil War America, where you can have basically a feudalized system, but the feudal system this time is a technocracy. What do you think about that?
I would argue that to the extent that's the trajectory that they're pursuing, and I would not disagree with the argument that that is, although I'd add some nuance to it. But I would argue that to the extent that that's what they're pursuing, what they're trying to do is recreate the Confederacy. What you had,
Right.
in 1810, 1820, the South was pretty much like the North in terms of, the political landscape.
Right.
And what happened is, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1897 and started marketing it in the 18 teens, 1797, and started marketing it in the 18 teens. And one machine could do the work of 50 enslaved people. It was also
Right.
a very expensive machine. And
Right.
so what happened was only the biggest plantations could afford a cotton gin, and then they got this massive economy of scale, and which I think is analogous to the assembly line with Henry Ford and to AI and search technology today. Excuse me, this technological change that allowed these large plantations to just wipe out their small competitors, and they ended up, turning everybody into sharecroppers. People had to sell their land to the big plantations and then continue to live on that land and work it on behalf of the big plantation owners. So what ended in the South by the 1840s, certainly by the mid 1840s, was democracy. It completely ended in the South. The South had become an oligarchy, period. And it transitioned through the next decade from the mid 1840s to the mid 1850s from an oligarchy into a dictatorship, which is what always happens with oligarchies. They don't always go to dictatorship, but they always go one of two ways. Either the oligarchs back off, which is what happened here in 1933 with FDR, when the businessmen just decided after they tried to kidnap and kill him, and it didn't work, and he called them out, they just decided, okay, we're just going to go back to making money. And they did that until 1981. That's one path that the oligarchs can take. The other path the oligarchs can take is to come down with an iron fist. And that's what they did in the South. They started hanging newspaper editors who were, in opposition to the oligarchs. They drove people out of the South. It became a brutal dictatorship that was, ruled by arguably a few hundred, maybe as many as 1,000 families who owned the largest plantations across 5 states.
Right.
And so this, I would argue that this is kind of the model for the tech bros, in that, they want to have all the information on us. They want to know everything about us. They want to basically be able to control our lives, economically and politically. They're doing a lot of this through the control of platforms of communication, through social media and search engines and things like that. And AI is the next big field for this. We have not yet started to see censorship on AI platforms the way that we see it on Facebook or Twitter or on Google, or on YouTube for that matter. I mean, yesterday on YouTube, I tried to put up a video of Rudolf Hess, the first use of the word homeland in the 1934
Right.
Nuremberg rally. And they blocked it, saying it violated community standards. I guess old Nazis are just unacceptable these days. But in any case, it seems to me that, yeah, there are some real analogies to be drawn there.
Well, and I think, you mentioned the assembly line, and there's another, I think the other analogy to draw is the crackdown on unionization and on anarchists and on communists and socialists, particularly after the Haymarket incident, where they, the first place they went to was the newspapers, and they raided and cracked down on the First Amendment. And
Yeah.
this, today we have a story from the Washington Post about a journalist having her house raided, in search of who's leaking that bad things about the administration. I mean, pretty blatant, chilling actions, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um, when and so, okay, so we've established that democracy is really more the innate place where humans, and I think there's one of the reasons I keep on phrasing it as democracy versus fascism is because when Mussolini was describing fascism, he described it as basically celebrating the beneficent inequality among humankind and saying it's therefore a precise negation of scientific Marxism, which assumes the equality among men. And I would say that's not just a precise negation of scientific Marxism, but then also democracy, which says, right, we are not, it's our value is not contingent based on our financial worth or the amount of property we own. In the case of consolidating the assembly line and factory work, or consolidating plantations, or consolidating all of the platforms that this conversation will be listened to on, certainly. And I think there's a great work to be done by all of us as individuals as we build a community beyond billionaires, because it's really frightening when you realize how few avenues we have to meet up with people that don't require basically a billionaire's technology to stand there between us and our family, or us and our friends, or anything like that. Gone are the days of, meeting people at the tavern either before or after work, depending upon what the nature of your work was, and just knowing you'd find the community there. What can we do in this, in this moment? And how do we build a vision? It seems difficult enough to maintain a democracy at this point, right? And I think we are, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say we are at both an existential place in this phase of the American democratic republic experiment, and also that we are at a crisis on par with the American Revolution, basically, where there's either going to be an America afterwards, or we're going to be put under the rule of a Hobbesian king, right? Because that is the other place where you see this sort of fundamental. That's where I wanted to go with this. Is it's people have to go along with a story in order to get us here, right? And there's basically two stories about our humanity. One, that we're inherently cooperative. This is the one told by Rutger Bregman in Humankind, more so also by David Graeber and The Dawn of Everything and other works of his. And then there's this other vision I would consider the John Locke, Jacques Rousseau kind of vision, and John Rawls, right? This lineage of philosophy, Marx too, I imagine. Sure, yeah, Kant also, versus the Hobbesian and the this conservative line of thought that says, look, there's going to be people who are better than you, and you got to fall in line underneath them, because you're probably not going to amount to much, and if you do, we'll see it, we'll pull you out of the masses. How do we get this story better understood, that we are better off in a cooperative state, that it's less at tension for ourselves and for the society, and that it does produce more material and immaterial wealth in the form of all sorts of things, right? How do we better tell this story so that, because a lot of the people we're looking at, the Republican leadership and the Marco Rubios of the world and the JD Vances of the world and the people who are going along with this because they're purely power craven. That's one thing. But how do we reach the average Trump voter, who is many of whom are regretting their vote again at this point, or for the first time maybe?
There's a lot of layers in that.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I kept on looking for an off ramp to make the question simple. I said I'd talk less, and then there I go. So thanks for bearing with me.
You're doing great, Trey. I think that starting with really simple distinctions is important. Democracy is a government that draws its authority from the consent of the governed, and the governed give that consent through elections. I mean, start with that simple premise,
right?
That in a democracy, what the majority of people want, as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution or the rights of other people, they get. We have not had that kind of government since the 1980s. The policies that have been pursued by all of these neoliberal administrations, the only one the only administration we've had since Reagan that was not neoliberal was Joe Biden. So the policies that were pursued by Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush,
Obama.
Obama, excuse me, Trump, and those policies were set into place by the second way that you can have governance, which is where what the people get is what the rich people decide they want to give them.
What Elizabeth Warren has very clearly said we have a choice between in the Democratic Party, and I agree wholeheartedly.
Right. Well, she's saying that, but here's the problem. You mentioned the Powell memo that Lewis Powell wrote in 1971, and then in 72, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And,
Right.
And by 73, we started to realize, oh, yeah, there it is. This was a plan for an oligarchic takeover of America, a corporate takeover of America. But it needed a predicate, which was the idea that corporations are persons and money is free speech. In other words, that wealthy people and big corporations could buy politicians, that we would shift from a political system where the people told the companies how to behave to where the companies tell the politicians how to behave and the politicians make the laws that define how the people to behave. That's oligarchy. So we know that over 70% of the American public since the 1980s have wanted a national healthcare system, have wanted free or low-cost college, have wanted the right to unionize, have wanted a higher minimum wage, have wanted our environment to be clean and increasingly pure, have wanted low-cost housing and energy, have wanted the poisons out of our food supply. None of those things have happened in 44 years. Even in the face of 70, 80, 90% public opinion in favor of them, because we're not a functioning democracy, we're an oligarchy. And what created this oligarchy were two Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s. In 76, Buckley versus Vallejo, which said that rich people can buy their own elections. And in the case of James Buckley. And then in 1978, First National Bank versus Bellotti, which said that corporations can also buy elections. And then, of course, this all got tripled down on with Citizens United in 2010. And the result of that is that the Supreme Court created a new system for America. Now, it's kind of an old system. It was an echo of what was going on during Reconstruction and during the Civil War in the South, where the oligarchs are running the show. But, it was new relative to the New Deal era. And that was, let's put the oligarchs back in charge. Well, the oligarchs have screwed everything up, and people are starting to get seriously pissed off at the oligarchs. And I think we're standing on the edge of a moment in time where people are not just going to, people are saying out loud, as you pointed out, Elizabeth Warren is saying, it's time for us to take that economic power away from the oligarchs. And you do that two ways. You do that by saying money is no longer speech and corporations are no longer persons. That's probably going to require a constitutional amendment. That's the book I'm working on right now, and that I wrote in 2001 on equal protection, excuse me. And then, so number one, you need to reverse that. And then number two, just explicitly saying that Elizabeth Warren's solution for the Democratic Party is stop taking their money. That's not always practical, sadly. But we have to get out of this system. And another way to do it, of course, would be for Congress to pass, at the very least, just campaign finance laws to stop this naked purchasing of the entire Republican Party and at least half of the Democratic Party. That's where our problem is. The fundamental cancer at the core of our democracy right now is the consequence of 5 bought off corrupt Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court. First in the 70s, the 78 Bellotti decision was actually written by Lewis Powell, and 5 more different ones in 2010 with Citizens United. And until we reckon with that, we're going to continue to have this struggle. I mean, 2026, the election this November, you're going to see. I mean, Elon Musk has already said that he's going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars to the table. Donald Trump has 140 billionaire families who give him money, who have given him money. You've got big corporations that are desperate for his approval. This is going to be a real tough election. Everybody thinks that the Democrats are going to sweep it. I'm not yet convinced of that. I think the trends are certainly pointing in that direction. but never underestimate what $1 billion will buy. It certainly bought Donald Trump the White House in 2024. And so that's the
Nothing
challenge.
worries me. Yeah, and nothing worries me more than when Democrats are feeling confident about an election that's 10 months away.
Yeah.
We need to work our asses off to make sure that people understand that we are there for them.
Yeah.
And you know, with that, I realized earlier, I guess it was last week, January 6th, 1941 was the day that FDR delivered his speech introducing the Four Freedoms. January 11th, 1944, he introduced the Second Bill of Rights, which we've talked about a number of times. In the meantime, in between there, they did polling about the things that he introduced in the Second Bill of Rights, which were also overwhelmingly popular. I talked to historian Harvey Kay about this last week, in to talk about those anniversaries and to talk about a vision forward. And it's the damn shame is that the war ended, and back home we did not continue to advance that vision. We kind of rolled back into a default of, and it happened so slowly, right? We're talking about basically 100 years now, 80 some years now, 84 years since 1941, or 85 years.
Mhm.
um, but and part of the I think what our work is, and you know this because I learned a lot about this through you, is making sure that people understand that these aren't radical ideas. What's radical is tearing down this American experiment at this point in time.
Yeah.
What is necessary, and you write in the hidden history of American democracy, is that we do again basically what we did twice before when we advanced hugely the rights. I sound like Donald Trump. Hugely the rights of Americans after the Civil War, and once again with the New Deal. And with the Great Society, I would say to a lesser extent, but an absolutely necessary one. And we have to do these things again, and we have to be bold, and we have to, because the vision that they're presenting and realizing on the streets of Minneapolis and in the streets of Venezuela, looking like perhaps Iran next, um, is one of basically unaccountable rich folk doing whatever they want and knowing that there's no repercussion. We didn't even talk about the civilian, the perfidy of pretending to be a civilian airplane and
Mhm.
bombing. I mean the stacks of war crimes. And I guess I'll just wrap up because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you have plenty more to digest and help get out for everyone to read. But and an ambulance went by right then, and that thought just went right out of my head. So, with that, I'll thank you for your time, Tom, and say we have it in our power to make the world new again. We also just did the 250th anniversary of the publication of Common Sense. So we have history and our own humanity to fall back on, but we all have our work to do. So, Tom, any last thoughts? I'm sorry, that ambulance went by and I completely lost where I was
No,
going.
it's all good, Troy. I think you were just recapping essentially what we had been discussing, and I just want to reiterate that democracy, small d democracy, power driving from the bottom up, not the top down, is the default system for most mammals, for most birds and fish, for many insects, and for us. And there's all kinds of variations on it, but that's the basic idea. It's built into our DNA. It's built into our genes. It's why it's such a seductive idea. It's why it's such a popular idea. And the thing that has always fought against that is, as Jefferson said, "I will never trust my nation to the rich." Where the rich are in charge, corruption always follows, and it's absolutely true. And that's what we have right now. We have the rich running our country and selecting our candidates and funding our elections and owning our companies and telling us that we can't have increases in the minimum wage and we can't have unions and we can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, we need to overthrow the oligarchy essentially, in a peaceful way, of course, a legal way,
Right.
but we need to
Amen.
reclaim democracy.
Yeah, I'll punctuate that by saying I notice when Elon Musk says that money will be worthless and we don't need to squirrel away for our retirements. Again, this is a guy who's about to be a trillionaire who stole all of our Social Security information. I
Yeah.
notice he doesn't include that it's because all of the automation will be publicly owned and we'll all be sharing in the benefits of that, which
He's
I'm afraid that he's telegraphing that he thinks this monopoly game is about to be done and he wants to own every piece of the board.
yeah.
So, but we have it in our power to defeat it. Thom Hartmann, again, America's #1 progressive talk radio host, author of dozens of books, including the one we've been discussing around, The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Thanks so much for your time, as always, Thom.
Yeah. Thanks, Troy. Thanks for inviting me on. It's always good to be with you.